announcement that we are using social media type things, including Twitter. So if you are on Twitter, you can go to the @RenoRhetoric is the tweet handle, and feel free to hashtag things like RSA, UNR, and climate change to be part of those conversations. And apparently they're also on Instagram, so our graduate students are all over that social media thing. So welcome back to our second panel on publics, counterpublics, and social activism. My name is Dr. Amy Payson, and I'm an assistant professor here at UNR in communication studies. I'm picking up on some of the themes that we've heard from our previous panel, thinking about those social change narratives that we might need to disrupt, or as Phaedra Mazzulla talks about, have some critical interruptions to get going and moving on climate change. A lot of what Klein talks about in the This Changes Everything documentary that we were able to show this past Wednesday is all about changing these narratives. Is it really about climate against economy? Is it really about how we use the earth as resources? Is that really how we're going to start this movement? So today to talk about the work of publics, counterpublics, and social activism in regards to climate change, we have Dr. Rob Asen, who will be talking on collective action in a neoliberal age. Can any cause bring people together? Dr. Asen is professor of rhetoric, politics, and culture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's written books on welfare and social security debates. Is probably very well known in our field in talking about publics and deliberation. He focuses on the ways that political, economic, and cultural inequities interact with relations of power shape discourse. He considers how powerful individuals and groups use discourse to maintain their privilege, and how marginalized people seek to overcome exclusions to represent their needs, interests, and identities in the public sphere. He also has co-edited collections with Dr. Dan Brower on counterpublics in the state and public modalities. Dr. Dan Brower is from the University of, or Arizona State University. Get that one right. He's an associate professor at the Hugh Downs School of Communication. As I mentioned, he's co-edited collections with Dr. Asen, counterpublics in the state and public modalities. He's also written the entry in communication as on counterpublics. Does a lot of work in counterpublic research in terms of AIDS and HIV work. And most recently and forthcomingly, he will have a chapter in an edited collection that looks at the intersection of social movements and counterpublics, looks at how counterpublics can go global, which I'll humbly say will change how we look at counterpublics. And lastly, Dr. John Ackerman is from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He's an associate professor of communication in the rhetoric area, where he teaches graduate courses on material and public space, social technologies, and participatory design. He also looks at how it considers how the built environment, collective memory, and institutional policies configure our cities and neighborhoods. And of particular interest are the zones and zones and policies that connect cities and campuses, and how engaged scholarship contributes to economic renewal. He also disclosed to me that he is a doubter of publics as a concept in some way, so we'll let him explain it.
You got my name wrong from the start. It's Ackerman. My ancestors are turning over.
Sorry about
Go
that.
ahead. It's fine. It's great.
So this paper will be on rhetorical violence and local communities. And since I've apparently butchered some of our introductions, I'll just turn it over to our presenters at this point.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks to all. I'm delighted to be here. I want to echo the comments in praise and applause of the grassroots who've done an amazing job putting this together. It's been incredible so far, so thank you all. And delighted to be here with my panelists. Capitalism, Naomi Klein tells us, complicates the progress or the prospects for progressive social change. Whether it is the creation of false crises that serve to weaken public policies combating inequality and fighting poverty, or cries for deregulation that leave the environment open to exploitation and degradation, capitalism holds the profit motive above all other aspirations, and it celebrates the sovereign individual against any attempts at coordinated social action. I want to take this general observation about capitalism and the spirit about which Naomi Klein talks about market logics, which appears in our contemporary age as a neoliberal regime of governance as my starting point. Along these lines, I want to consider a quality of our neoliberal moment, specifically as it relates to the prospect for action among publics and counterpublics. And that is the eclipse of a public good. In the United States and in many other societies, people have lost faith in the public good. The idea and the practice of acting in public with others in ways that carry meaning and force that exceed the capacity of individuals as an aggregation of means. Hannah Arendt referred to such coordinated action as a distinctive mode of power, an energy that appeared as an alternative to authoritarianism, whether by institutions or tyrants. Arendt observed that power springs up between people when they act together and vanishes the moment they disperse. As Arendt's observation suggests, this power implies people acting together, not simply showing up at an event at the same time. Evidence for the eclipse of a public good comes from a variety of different sources. For one, public opinion researchers have found a clear, steady, decades-long decline in people's trust of each other and the governing institutions that supposedly represent them. On a range of public issues, from race in the United States to immigration to the environment, we see a sharp politics of resentment that views politics not as a means of amelioration, but as a kind of protective wedge against threatful others who may approach on our interests and needs. On the policy front, the eclipse of a public good manifests in calls by policymakers to privatize seemingly everything, with education, the supposed bedrock of democracy, as a conspicuous example. And we see this in the rush for vouchers in K-12 education, in charter schools, and the kinds of market logics that inform discussions of STEM fields in higher education. For public sphere scholars, the eclipse of a public good is the most direct challenge that a neoliberal mode of governance presents for our models of public engagement by publics and counterpublics. Neoliberalism, no doubt, is a widely used term in contemporary scholarship, and it holds different meanings for the scholars who use it. In his foundational account, David Harvey explains that neoliberalism upholds individual freedom as a supreme value and holds that individual freedoms are guaranteed by the freedom of the market and of trade. As this characterization suggests, freedom from a neoliberal worldview is a decidedly economic virtue, unmoored from concerns with social justice. In this spirit, Harvey defines neoliberalism as a political project to reestablish the conditions for capital accumulation and to restore the power of economic elites. In more recent scholarship, Wendy Brown presents a far more reaching conception of neoliberalism as a mode of reason that constructs persons and states on the model of the contemporary firm, such that persons and states are expected to comport themselves in ways that maximize their capital value in the present and enhance their future value. And both persons and states do so through practices of entrepreneurialism, self-investment, and attracting investors. Contra Harvey, Brown argues that neoliberalism is an economic rather than a political project, because neoliberalism displaces the political values of solidarity that inform the polis, and because neoliberalism reconfigures individual subjectivity to the exclusion of a political sensibility. She writes that neoliberal rationality disseminates the model of the market to all domains and activities, even where money is not at issue, and configures human beings exclusively as market actors. More than a set of policies or a class-based politics, neoliberalism from this vantage point poses a fundamental threat to the public sphere. In the remainder of my presentation, I want to consider the qualities of a public good and the implications of its eclipse for the public sphere. I want to consider how this eclipse calls into question the possibility of collective action, the basis of engagement for publics and counterpublics alike. However, I also want to underscore the historical character of my remarks. I am not making an ontological argument, nor a teleological argument, nor a totalizing argument. Although I align myself with Brown's explication of neoliberalism, I depart from her account in the totality of her argument, her position that Homo economus has vanquished Homo politicus. Instead, I see neoliberalism as a dominant social force, but not an all-encompassing force. We face a choice analogous to what Jürgen Habermas described in the structural transformation of the public sphere. In that mid-20th century work, Habermas wondered about the prospects of critical publicity against an emergent, depoliticized, managed publicity. Against organized user interests, emancipatory change, in Habermas's view, required the organization of publics. Today, we may consider how democratic public engagement may resist neoliberal governance. Although I do not have the time to develop this in my presentation, I see resistance to neoliberalism most prominently in local communities, where ordinary folks have worked together to reclaim their schools, for example, an issue I know well, and to reassert their individual and collective agency against wider forces. I'm with Larry Crowley on this one, in that I think any kind of response against neoliberalism has to happen at the local level, where, as he put it, the action is. Before I consider the consequences of an eclipse of a public good, I want to suggest some qualities of a public good as it informs the dynamics of publics and counterpublics. A public good, as I see it, is a belief-practice structure. All three parts of my hyphenated concept operate together, even as one part sometimes may appear more prominent than others. As a belief, a public good refers to the shared and circulating conceptions that publics construct and sustain about the connections among their participants. In this spirit, Habermas writes of the creation of a bourgeois subject through the world of letters that enabled political action. John Dewey sees the basis of publics in the perception of the indirect consequences of human action that implicate others. Implication alone is an insufficient condition for the formation of publics, Dewey reminds us, because members must perceive their shared interests. A public good in this sense may be said to tie together the members of publics as, in Benedict Anderson's famous phrase, an imagined community. As a practice, a public good refers to the actions of people working together to achieve desired, commonly valued ends. Public practices, from this perspective, are not altruistic. They are productive. We do not comport our practice with the public good by selflessly setting aside our own interests and needs, but by recognizing and acting on the recognition that some of what we wish to achieve may be achieved through the coordinated and/or accumulated effort of others. In the process, our perceptions of our desired ends may transform. Parents may send children to public schools because they want their children to obtain an education that will portend future success, and they may realize that one family alone cannot ensure the availability of a quality public education. In this way, the practice of a public good, as Dewey has written about democracy more generally, mediates individual and community. Further, the practice of a public good resists its bifurcation as a concept that should be applied to practice. With a public good, theory and practice are mutually constitutive. A public good requires action to appear, but this action itself requires faith in its efficacy. A public good may be structured when the beliefs and actions of people lead them to build institutions, laws, forums, and policies that enable and sustain the opportunities and abilities of individuals to realize their agency and bolster their community. An affordable and uniformly competent public school system, which today seems to apply only for wealthy white communities, would constitute an example of a structure that could enable and sustain individuals and communities. So too would an open and equal system of political elections, which would be informed by the equal standing of citizens, rather than the unequal wealth of donors. That structures may be created with an eye towards the public good, and that they also may confound a public good, reminds us that action in the public sphere is not shaped by human agency alone. Material constraints and opportunities may position some people to act efficaciously in public while frustrating the actions of others. Yet connecting these structures to a public good, or to its absence, reminds us that structures are not immutable natural conditions. They rise through human choices and actions. And here, too, we may discern a mutually constitutive relationship between practice and structure. So what happens, then, when this belief, practice, structure of a public good goes into eclipse? To be clear, what this question interrogates is not the loss of a widely shared notion of a public good. That is, it's not a question about the ascription of a particular, supposedly universal content to the public good. Nor is this a question of negotiating public and private within and across publics. On both accounts, public sphere scholars have, for the past few decades, embraced the model of a multiple public sphere that circulates varied and sometimes competing views of the public good. Indeed, counter-publicity often takes aim at particular notions of the public good, pointing out their exclusions and violations. Instead, what is at stake is the very possibility of a public good itself, of shared political goals, values, and resources that exceed individual interests. In this context, references to public pursuits and political discourse may appear as ideological appeals. Ideological in the classical sense of the representation of the interests of the few as the interests of the many. On this point, Wendy Brown holds that neoliberal modes of governance may turn the language of democracy against itself, redefining and redeploying key terms and phrases towards non-democratic ends. Brown argues that this is an apolitical condition in which the substance of many significant features of constitutional and representative democracy have been gutted, jettisoned, or end-run as they continue to be promulgated ideologically, serving as a foil and a shield for their undoing. This dynamic appears prominently in the neoliberal embrace of freedom, which often articulates wealthy and privileged interests while constraining the agency of others. Another example circulates in the justifications to curtail voting rights through the appeals of safeguarding elections from voter fraud. Ostensibly necessary measures like photo IDs and proof of citizenship stand as guarantees of public interest while obfuscating the uneven burdens they place on people to produce such documentation. A public sphere reconfigured through the eclipse of a public good replaces coordination with competition as a primary organizing social principle. Competition casts social interaction as a zero-sum game. One person's success and status depend on denying success and diminishing the status of others. From the perspective of competition, social resources are perceived as finite. Recognizing the standing and facilitating the agency of another appears to limit one's own standing and agency. Denying agency and autonomy to others then presents a strategic advantage. This stands in stark contrast to the perceptions and practices of a critical publicity. As Nancy Fraser, Dan Brower, and others have noted, counter-publics affirm their public status in part because their advocacy and engagement potentially expands discursive space for others who may not affiliate with the counter-public. Inequality is both the condition and end of competition. To win, competitors must become unequal to others. Against an aim of social justice, inequality appears not as a problem to solve, but as the starting and end points of agency. Perceiving interlocutors as others, as obstacles to one's goals. Competition denies people's personhood. Changing beliefs and practices in the public sphere may motivate different policies that remake institutions and structure. Policies depend on the beliefs and practices of both lay people and policymakers, especially the ways that they envision the relationships among members of a polity. If people see themselves as involved in a mutual project, then they may support and construct policies that support these connections. Alternatively, envisioning social bonds as subordinate to individuals may produce policies that foreground individual responsibility and risk. These potential changes occur in a social setting in which some people are better positioned to influence and make policy than others. Institutional changes, in turn, may make it harder for some people to enact change than others, intensifying social inequalities and differently enacted individualism. Structures, unless pushed, default to a status quo. My last point concerns the subjectivities that may circulate in a public sphere without a public good. We must ask, what kind of subjectivity does this climate create? And who among the members of a polity may enact this subjectivity? Elevation of the market as a model for human activity suggests that the subjectivity afforded in this reconfigured environment is that of the consumer. And Wendy Brown notes that the model of the market is internalized in contemporary society, such that people must become discrete capitalists to survive. We must internalize this model in our own behaviors, fostering our own individual competitiveness as a worthwhile investment. Further, she argues, this is an acutely gendered subjectivity, since the need for non-market caring activities remain, but they become socially invisible. Women disproportionately serve as the invisible infrastructure that holds together the narrow neoliberal conception of subject. As Brown writes, women both require the visible social infrastructure that neoliberalism aims to dismantle through privatization, and are the invisible infrastructure sustaining a world of putatively self-investing capitals. I would add to this trenchant observation that we should consider how others, too, who may be discredited by a market model because of race, ethnicity, or some other marker, also may become embedded in this invisible infrastructure. In closing, I want to reiterate that this is a historical account. I have discussed a contemporary development, but lingering and emergent resistances may arise. And as I've kind of signaled, I see some of that possibility at the local level. For now, however, I'll leave it to my colleagues and perhaps to conversation to talk about some of these possibilities against the neoliberalism of that industry.
Well, it's true, I don't exactly know what a public sphere is or a public. I don't doubt it so much. I just try to frame my work a little bit differently. So sorry about my outburst on that point. My name's Ackerman, it's Dutch plow. So plowman, farmer, or you could call it tool. So anyway, John Ackerman. And thanks to Blake, Jason, Kat, and Phil in particular for your hospitality and pick up some audio. Many texts and emails, and to Kathy and everybody for inviting us here. Quite pleased and quite honored. I enjoyed reading Klein's This Changes Everything, which is to say that I'm reading it now, which is to say that her book joins the many that I'd like to read but haven't quite found the time. It's not a kind of work that I'm drawn to very often. But like her, I'm inspired and chagrined by people who take to the streets. And I too respond to the bodily protest, the image of the bodily protest just juxtaposed to journalistic and then statistical accounts of planetary demise. I watched a film on Wednesday night and I heard the threat of masses speak clearly, yet as I sat there, trained as I am to look for difference, I began to imagine what was missing in her account. I just can't help myself, I guess. The change she champions requires love and respect of place, a biophilia that pulls the planet closer to life worlds and works to usurp the machine rationality that has enslaved the planet in modernity. Yet I wanted to hear something on the informatics that drive both global economics and that erode the self in the company of others. I wanted to see more images of people in cities, on streets, not in protest, but going to the park or going to work because half of the planet's population live in some form of urban environment, a figure soon to reach 70%. Professor Jose Samper from MIT recently visited our environmental design program at UC Boulder to present on the rise of the informal city. If half the planet is urban, half of that population live in informal cities, a territorial accumulation of human capital distinct from 19th and 20th century formations. Therefore, human life is learning to live in unimagined spaces, and Samper's plea for Medellin, Colombia is to watch closely how this happens, as it may be coming to a neighborhood near you. Jose grew up in Medellin and woke to gunshots and mysterious death because his neighborhood was overrun with drug traffic. Yet drug-related violence did not spark the demand for territorial mutation. Global economic policies created the vacuum that drug-related commerce fulfilled. When new urban technologies emerge, populated by regional diaspora, a process unfolds, and this is some findings from this research, wherein goodwill, the desire for basic sustenance, maternal affiliation precede governmental control in the usual sense, and then the drug lords move in, followed by the federales, all of this fostered by global trade and the war on drugs. I agree with Samper. We need to watch everyday life unfold in perilous times. I want more quotidia while we aspire to join Blockadia. That's my applause line. I did read that chapter. I want more images of ordinary life alongside images of direct confrontation. Public protest must happen, and it's certainly time to seize the territorial expansion of economic interest, but other inflations need to join into the global movement. Klein turns to indigeneity to illustrate the powers of the common when ethnic regional communities refuse to divide their cosmological selves from their ecological blood. If water mediates the life world of indigenous people, taking form, for example, as the Save the Fraser Declaration representing 130 First Nations, then let water constitute our common planetary predicament, she proposes. The truth about water emerges from the voices and the lives of those most threatened, and to quote Klein, these truths emerge not out of abstract theory about the commons. Point noted. But I want to radicalize the commons in ways she has not considered, so that frequencies of exposure, circulation, embodiment, just practices, hover in a singularity that would embrace water rights and city rights, and indigeneity given to people who live in trammeled as well as untrammeled places. The problem is not that our theories of the common are too abstract, it's that they're not abstract enough. In everyday life in the modern world, Henri Lebesgue grants the resident a phenomenology of recurrence. Gestures of labor and leisure, mechanical movement, both human and properly mechanic, hours, days, weeks, months, years, and linear and cyclical repetition, natural and rational time, the study of creative activity, that is, of production in the widest sense, habitation exposed to simultaneity and interconnection of modernity and everydayness, a reciprocity, not as signifier and signifying, but as the crown and the veil. The quotidian is what is humble and solid, what is taken for granted, and from all parts that follow each other in a regular, unvarying succession. A pulsing life world that affects objects and beings with a praxis and a poiesis in the residuum of all the possible specific and specialized activities outside of social experience and the product of society in general. An escape route from the tyranny of banality and exhaustive consumption is adaptation of body, time, space, desire from recurrent gestures of a world of sensory experience. A conceptual domain, a doxa, that slips artfully between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between the concept city and its bodily and technical derivations, and finally a publicity based not only in consumption, conquest, and control, but also the imaginary existence of things, a rhetoric and poetry superimposed on the art of consuming and inherent in its image, a rhetoric that is not restricted to language, but invades experience. Now that's a paragraph that would piss off most journalists. It is very abstract. Sorry?
Oh, new journalism is going in that direction, at least one cycle.
Okay. And we know that Henri Lefebvre cared most about his homeland. He cared about France, a place assaulted simultaneously by ideological and economic fascism in the middle part of the 20th century. Yet I wrote that paragraph to collocate the quotidian that Lefebvre considers as he tried to insert its project into the broadest spectrum of planetary life, in the streets of Medellin and in the northern territories of British Columbia, and then we could go around it. Of course, there are real differences between people and places, so I know that. But also we need to foster an analogical sensibility, such that indigeneity circulates between the city and the countryside, between urban, pre-urban, post-urban forms. If biophilia has if it's radically common in this way, I think we not only march to thwart economic colonialism and environmental injustice, we comprehend its spatial scale, as Sanford instructs. We scale up the love that Klein foregrounds, and we respect what appears in residence as specialized knowledge. Now let me work through a couple of examples to see if this can in some way work. Charles Bowden, in his book Murder City, paints the atmospherics of abject affect in Juarez, Mexico, resulting from the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA followed shortly after globalization was announced in 1988 in sync with the first attempts to cut greenhouse emissions. What matters in NAFTA for Bowden is not globalization per se, but how policy debates papered over the devastation of peasant architecture in Mexico. Wages dropped and increased shipment of goods from Mexico created a perfect cover for the movement of drugs that the endless stream of semi-trucks had ignored. Bowden writes that violence is everywhere. And these are his words. And he wrote there. Everyone is dying, and in this new way of life, no one is really in charge. We are all in play, and I feel this in my bones. The violence has crossed class lines. The violence is everywhere. The violence is greater. The violence has no apparent and simple source. It is like dust. Dust in the air, part of life itself. As affect external to capital, or to be a precondition for innovation or justice, we find it in the dust, rust, and melancholy. Bowden continues, to notice it would require concentration. To ignore it would be an invitation to death. Now, I do not borrow Bowden's words or someone else's devastation, nor do I write, which I do, about the repurposing of post-industrial neighborhoods in Cleveland to incite empathy or emotion. I think that would be a cheap trick. But it seems we have a choice as to which stories we tell, how we hear them, and the dynamics of incursion. So let me try another. In Santiago de Compostela, Spain, in 2013, a commuter train traveling twice its prescribed speed left the tracks along a sharp bend, killing and injuring nearly all of the 200 passengers. By journalist Miguel Ángel Morado's account, and speaking as a resident as much as an observer, causality lies well beyond driver error, and whatever technological limitations found in complex systems, or even corporate pressure to monetize risk, choosing speed over safety. In the train engineer's words, as he stumbled bloodied from the wreck, we are all human. We are all human. Indeed we are. But for Morado, there lingers a haunting authority, as if we should know better when catastrophe is coming our way. A smooth mind, a disposition Keith Bassel learned from the Apache, an awareness that depends on a residential understanding, the kind of life-world memory in place, practice over time, and the wisdom of caution by virtue of long, slow lessons that speak to otherwise lost dimensions of catastrophe and resilient recovery. Morado, the writer, as resident, assigns blame to a cultural geographic desire for inclusion in a global economy, the need for speed, in a region of Spain with forbidding geographies and complicated settlement patterns. In his words, the bend where this accident happened has a story to tell that is noticeably sharp, a typical product of our landscape. The very day the line was inaugurated in 2011, many passengers noticed a strange shock when entering the bend, and Morado concludes, maybe we should have listened to our geography. But everybody was united in our enthusiasm for inclusion, participation, and identification in a competitive global community. And just a few weeks ago, Matthew Schaer begins his retrospective study of the Amtrak derailment in D.C. by standing near the tracks. You could have heard Amtrak 188 coming before you saw it, in the hum of the rail bed and the metallic shiver of the electricity in the overhead catenary wires. What is this common noise? These vibrations, these earthly connections, this doxa. In both cases, I see economic violence at work through global policies that alter cities that malign the poor, while concurrently expediting the flow of people and capital. Yet it is in the everyday in which violence metastasizes, mutating from policy to poesis and requiring a different kind of journalistic attention. Michel Calon has called all disciplinary formations on the carpet for advancing a self-fulfilling prophecy that they know before they're able to see. Disciplines make the object studied as much as the objects are ready to be studied. Economists make the markets they study by choosing distinct forms of statistical reasoning. Environmental scientists make the climates they study by relying on a subset of evidential reasoning. Journalists do the same thing, and I suppose it's true for rhetoric too. We find that sometimes the reality that we are most comfortable is in finding. Now, there's nothing wrong with a disciplinary myopia unless somebody gets hurt, unless prediction turns into projection. Instead of self-fulfilling prophecy, Calon proposes that we frame economic performance as a socio-technical adjustment. Adjustments, their arrangements endowed with the capacity to act depending on their configuration, but never really reduced to pure worlds of words and static interlocutors. Do that, and professional observers might well be surprised by events that happen independently of what humans believe or think. Returning to my central thesis, let's imagine a common plane of precarious life so that indigenous wisdom can be found in urban as well as pristine and threatened places. To do that, enunciation underscores the fact that any statement defines its context and meaning only in relation to that context and others. Enunciation eclipses expression by taking into account materialities irreducible to institution, norms, roads, and tools. So that puts me on the outside of public spirit theory. I feel like I'm actually in there, but I just don't talk about it quite the same way. So damn straight I'm being abstract. And where's the rhetoric in all of this? I don't have time to make a longer argument, but suffice it to say that rhetoric contributes to public life as expression, that it needs to give in to its own self-fulfilling prophecy. That's fine until it bumps into economic and ecological precarity. Writing is terrorism for Lefebvre because writing makes law is in fact law. Rhetorical violence is the violence of omission, a learned inattentiveness toward ecological shock. I am far from guiltless in these matters. I've used post-industrial to label communities in which I've lived and studied and suffered from the same global trade policies that climb the mountains and that reach all the way down to Juarez. I've been trapped by categorical intolerance, a way of thinking that, to quote Kathleen Stewart, slides over the live surface of difference at work in the ordinary to arrive at bigger structures and underlying causes. These neighborhoods are poorer than many, but then poverty is one of those rational metrics of economic and social prescription. Instead of post-industrial, I've turned lately to the idea of ruination, a construct from anthropological studies of life in vivo after the war machines have gone away and the residues of violence remain. It's not just another label to paste on to a dire scenario. I believe it redirects critical attention to performance, enunciation, and a critical qualitative method. In the 2007 Malinowski lecture, Professor Gail Navarro-Yashin proposes an anthropology of ruination to capture, if not capitalize upon, the long, lingering hangover of violence that hangs in the air like fog, that settles in crevices like dust, that laminates the surfaces of modern innovation like rust on everyday objects, spaces, and vanquished territories. Dust in Cyprus, dust in Juarez, dust in Kent, Ohio, where I've lived and studied. Dust that gives rise to what Navarro-Yashin calls a local moral discourse, or what Gibson and Graham would call an intentional economy. If a local moral discourse sounds like a mustering of democracy, ethnic preservation, or wise use economic development, it could be. Ruination has a surface, and it circulates as patterned matter that gives rise to melancholic speech and bodily gestures, a field, as it were, on which subject and objects commingle on the plains of war-torn Cyprus some 40 years later, as it commingles in Kent, Ohio, following the slaying of students by the guard of the nation. Ruination breaks through the logic of economic excess to the residuum, to let the residuum exert itself as a basis for making do, the basis for getting by, for finding the available means. Ruination opens up a negative dialectic that does not choose between the elite mind and the subaltern body. Negative dialectics purposely sideline causality to table the question of who to blame for economic and ecological injustice. Blame will be assigned. Klein did that in her book. She turns to biophilia, and I turn there too, but the difference is that I also consider the wisdom of resonance as it occurs variously because that has been a constant for living as it has always been. Ruination is not the result of nefarious capitalism for those who live within it. It's a condition for recovery. Maybe it's time to set capitalism aside, at least just for the moment, to let quasi-events appear that provide the preconditions in which some new social content might be nurtured.
I just want to offer another round of thanks to everyone who made this come together here today. I love the idea of having a day-long discussion about this. It's really quite splendid. In preparation for a graduate seminar on rhetoric in the public sphere, I had recent occasion to revisit John Dewey's The Public and Its Problems. In the early pages, as my friend and colleague Asa noted, there's an account of the emergence of publics. In fact, a sort of equation or a stage-based model. What is a public? Human association plus indirect consequences plus recognition of indirect consequences plus self-articulation in relation to those indirect consequences leads to the emergence of the public. And it strikes me that environmental awareness and activisms, including climate change activism, exemplify this model of awareness. And we can see in some of the work of some environmental activists to articulate a notion of downwind. Klein, in her TED Talk, gives us the example of higher cancer rates among First Nation people in relation to the Alberta tar sands. But we can also look at Jennifer Peoples' work, looking to make downwind, to think about downwind as a kind of idiograph and work that does. I think those are some good examples, maybe, of this kind of emergence of public and environmental relation to that. It's been a pleasure to engage Klein's work. I have looked at her book, her TED Talk, and several of her other online videos, and no one will mistake me for a climate change or environmental activist, but I find in her work many intersections with rhetorical studies and some compelling analogies from radical AIDS activism, which has been the focus of my research, as Dr. Mason pointed out. So one of the pleasures is that there's so many points of engagement for those of us who are invested in rhetorical studies and social movements. I'll note a few of them very briefly before pausing on some more specific topics. Exigence, the imperfection marked by urgency. Circa 2009, she has someone saying we have only 1 decade left. But also the rhetorical crafting of exigence. If the facts or the conditions don't make us feel imperfection, then there's space for us to rhetorically craft a sensation of exigence. So I think that's really quite interesting. Klein encourages us to think about, or to remind ourselves about the power of condensation symbols. If visual images count as symbols, in Kenneth Burke's rendering of condensation symbol, she notes the example of the flaming water in the documentary Gasland. And in her TED Talk, she says that instead of a plaque reading, "What would you attempt to do if you knew you could not fail?" that she locates in various corporate CEO offices, she recommends an image of Icarus and the constant possibility of failure that that image suggests. Some newer examples might include the bird's eye infrared moving images of climate-threatening methane in the leak near Porter Ranch, California. So various websites, we see that a GIF or a video of the moving image here as a kind of condensation symbol. Bottles of murky water from Flint, Michigan. Other examples of condensation symbols that do incredibly powerful work. Another example, the promises and challenges of collaboration. And I see in Klein's work some gestures toward what might be called seriality. So based off of the work of Sartre and Iris Marion Young, Carmen Forrest Campbell, Jeff Bennett, they've tried to talk about seriality as kind of temporary orientations around objects as ways of doing activist work with other people. And then another example of work with other people would be coalition building. And Professor Carmen Chavez has carefully articulated the precise dynamics of coalition building. It's different from seriality, but both of them are forms of being in work with other people. And then finally, I see in her work very interesting examples of witnessing, learning from, and appropriating or borrowing tactics from other social movements. And she knows within a Western context, the triumvirate of civil rights, women's rights, and gay and lesbian rights. But she expands globally as well to say post-colonial independence movements maybe give us some ideas about how we might do our work. So these are just a few of the many points of engagement for those of us who are interested in rhetoric and social movements and public and countercultures. And I think one of the charges of our time together today across these 4 sessions is to consider how to make her and other radical new visions sayable and intelligible, to think and strategize alongside her and alongside each other. And so I'll focus my comments on a couple of things here. The first is this notion of privatization of the public sphere as one pillar of an ideological blockade. I was really struck by what she calls an ideological wall. The 3 pillars: privatization of the public sphere, but I also think that she means technical encroachment, not just privatization, but technical encroachment. Second pillar, deregulation of the corporate sector. Third pillar, lower corporate taxation. And so focusing on this privatization or technicalization, technical encroachment of the public sphere is one of the specific prompts that we were given for this panel as a possibility, so I'm going to kind of present that. And then the second topic, I think, to focus on today is her call for us to shift the cultural context, that's her phrase, and the importance of mass movements, in her view, toward the end of the book, as our greatest hope. She says, if there is a reason for social movements to exist, it is not to accept dominant values as fixed and unchangeable, but to offer other ways to live. And so I think that if we have studied social movements, we know that they have long encountered, however, the challenge of shifting the cultural context in terms of a number of things, but something that I'll call intelligibility. So there are a couple of intelligibility challenges, I think, to mass movements, and those involve systems or ecological thinking. How do we say that better so that that sticks better? And then materialist analysis. And so Professor Condon's remarks earlier today, I think we're bolstering along that trajectory that we're going to take. So in terms of privatization or technical encroachment of the public sphere, it's very common. Talk or public discourse is sometimes framed as an obvious good. Talk is good, more talk is better. Klein, we know, and Klein pungently reminds us that sometimes talk, whether we call it dialogue or negotiations or other things, arises as obstacle or sustainer of inaction. Perhaps even worse than the seeming naturalness of capitalism, she argues, quote, is the fetish of centrism, of reasonableness, seriousness, splitting the difference and generally not getting overly excited about anything. And so we see here her concern about the tamping down roles of reason, some forms of reasoning and some norms in the public sphere. So we see her skepticism toward certain framings of public discourse, and we also know that the record of history offers ample examples where calls for reasonable discourse and patience are made for odious purposes, leading to counter calls like from Martin Luther King for the fierce urgency of now. Right? So let's maintain vigilance against certain abuses of public deliberation or calls for talk and that sort of thing. But I don't think that we give up on public deliberation completely. Klein doesn't. I think my panelists would say that we don't give up on it completely either. The public sphere and dominant publics that constitute it will remain a salient front, to use a war metaphor, in climate change activism. The public sphere may not be the most important site. It might not be the most effective site at all times, but it should hold and retain our skepticism for sure. So we fight against privatization or technical encroachment We try to burst open, create breaks in this ideological wall or this ideological blockade, in part, I think, through counterpublics, and maybe this is why I was invited to come today. So in one of my works, I've recognized what I call generative potentialities, or generative potentials for counterpublic theories, that counterpublic theory offers to us as we study communication. And one of those generative potentials is to expand our objects of inquiry on rational critical norms of public deliberation. This is basically a defense of unreasonableness, a defense of embodied, thank you, just performed up here if you didn't hear. A defense of embodied and corporeal forms of activism and intervention. And this is why I'm so sad that Professor DeLuca is not with us, because he's an environmental activist who traffics in theories of public and screen and all sorts of things. And he's done so much work that I think I'm going to sort of report out some of the things that he talked about in his conversation starter video, which I watched. And I think I just want to add in by proxy to our conversation here. And so these aren't secrets, this is a public document, so I'm not talking out of turn. He's done so much important work to emphasize the use of bodies and display. And he also, in that conversation starter, suggests that after industrialism, humanism is one of the most dangerous ideologies against environmentalism. And he has some interesting things to say about whenever we emphasize reasonable language as a mechanism to participate in public deliberation, we permit ourselves to erase or diminish animals who are not human from the realm of the consideration of lives that matter. I think that's an interesting thing to bring up here. He wants to talk less about rhetoric as persuasion and more about force, through which rhetoric is one of the technologies of force. And he says what changed everything was the force of the images of droughts and wildfires. Affective events that have force, that don't fit into the model of the reason, that force us to feel about the world differently. We are disrupted from how we have been thinking about the world. And so I think this is one of the generative potentials of counterpublic theory, which is always in conversation with people on the ground who are actually doing activist work. So that sort of dialectic of what people are doing helps us build theory. Theory helps us to maybe craft our activisms. Some other generativities of counterpublic theory involve, in my view, recognizing that there are multiple publics, and we should pay attention to the mediations and translations among these publics, that the relations between dominant and subordinate have force, but they're contingent, and they are alterable, and that offers some hope. And that we should recognize resource disparities. And I, again, appreciate Professor Conley's remarks about materiality. So I think these last three generativities can sort of help us think about how to crack open this ideological wall, this ideological blockade. And I make reference here to the example of radical AIDS activism from the 1980s and 1990s. There, I think we could see three orientations for addressing the problem of the privatization or the technical encroachment of the public sphere. One orientation towards science and the public was to tamp down the significance of science, especially in the early years of the epidemic. Science doesn't know a lot, even though it's supposed to, and it thinks that it does. So we call science out for not knowing as much as it thinks it does, or it thinks it should. The second orientation, we maintain the validity of science and join it. And so Fabian Savnosky's enduringly interesting and important essay on the rejuvenation of the public sphere through radical AIDS activism shows us how AIDS activists did this. You maintain the validity of science, but you join it. You self-educate so that you can talk and say stop, no, and these sorts of things. So entrance into these expert conversations, though, were pried open in part through autodidacticism, what they call self-teaching, but also through radical direct action. Right? So it's not just you learn the science and then you have a deliberation about the science. You force your bodies into places where they're not supposed to be. And so we have occupation of pharmaceutical company offices, we've got protests at the Food and Drug Administration in Rockville, Maryland, and all sorts of things. And so teaching oneself and being unruly were simultaneous forms. So the unreasonableness, the radicality, the corporeality, the disruptions of business as usual as counter-public tactics were simultaneous with enjoining the technical sphere, challenging the authority of the technical sphere, and rejuvenating the public sphere. Now there's some concern here about the purity of politics, and that's an enduring sort of question that I merely note here and not resolve. I note too that in Klein's account there are a few organizations working in the name of the environment that meet the threshold of purity. So that's interesting. A third orientation modeled from radical AIDS activism is that we value certain forms and practices of science over others. And so as we have climate change doubters, we had AIDS dissidents, people who did not believe that HIV led to the condition of AIDS. And there are very interesting parallels about how we open up space or don't, and if we shut down space, then we're orthodox, and we're disrupting the proper conduct of science. So that's one of the issues that I want to point on. The second, on shifting the cultural context, and I'm seeing the time is moving rather quickly. I think there's a challenge here in terms of teaching ourselves and speaking out about systems or ecological relationships. And I'll just make a quick reference here to President Obama's State of the Union address of January 2016. He expressed support for renewable energies, but then added the punchline, gas under $2 a gallon ain't bad either. Okay, so that punchline, I think is an expression of the challenge at hand. Delinking the economic efficiencies of an ostensibly free market, and fracking is involved in that $2 equation, not as the prime cause, but it's correlated to that. And as we know, fracking is grossly polluting, and so there's some that was an example of the challenge that's in place. The last thing that I'll point to is what I think is a challenge, but also something that we're goaded by in ways by Klein's work, a materialist analysis. And this is about climate change science could or should be a catalyst for forms of social and economic justice, particularly among communities that are adversely affected. This brings up, I think, the question or the topic of what Judith Butler and others would call precarity. Right? It's already been mentioned here. Livable lives, whose lives are worth caring about, acting about, legislating about, whose lives are livable and grievable. And I think that the fact of environmental racism and the disproportionate impacts of climate change on the world's under-resourced and the world's structurally abjected explain the existence of an enduring need for an environmental justice movement that unfolds and communicates materialist analysis in its social activism.
So we do have 15 minutes for questions before lunch, so let's get up to
I'd like to give my thanks to the panel, even the Luca who wasn't here, who appropriately cited. It's a wonderful panel. Asen, as you were talking, I started to hear nihil liberalism. I wonder if nihil is the wrong prefix. It should be N-I-H-I-L. Is it nihil liberalism you're really thinking?
Well, I mean, and I think perhaps that's in part a consequence of where I chose to focus this talk.
Influenced my theory, I think.
But I really think that I want to underscore the historical sort of quality of my argument. That, I mean, it is a social force, and I think one we have to reckon with, and I would argue a dominant social force. It's become the common sense, right? It's become the default position. And so it presents a fundamental challenge for environmental activists, for defenders of public education.
But nihil means new, and Klein argues that extractivism is sanitary. So nihil.
Well, the neo in neoliberalism is so old. So old school neoliberalism had a sense of the social. I mean, old school liberalism, excuse me, had a sense of the social. So, I mean, if you look at Adam Smith, if you look at all those folks, they talk about exchange. Exchange is a social connection between the two, right? The contract is a social connection. It's not necessarily a democratic connection. It's grounded in the market. But what old school liberalism retained is the sense of the social, which still allowed space for the idea that the economic wasn't everything. Right? If you maintain a faith in the idea of a social bond, that people achieve what they wish to achieve by working with others, then it retains a space for these other non-market activities. I think the argument about neoliberalism is the diminishing of the social, right? That it's not through contract, it's not through these forms of market exchange that we achieve what we want. It's through our own, it's the internalization of the market model and the sense that we act as individuals with a capital I. Now there's a longer tradition to that for sure. So Milton Friedman in 1962 in Capitalism and Democracy was arguing that there is no such thing as society, right? There are only individuals. So you can trace a longer intellectual lineage. But that's how, but that's why it's all of these things, and these things aren't necessarily contemporaneous. We can trace a longer intellectual lineage. We can trace institutional shifts and structural changes and changes in practice. So I think it's been around, but the distinction between the liberalism and neoliberalism is the social and what happens to the social.
And a follow-up to that. Yeah, I really like those distinctions. I think what often gets lost, and exactly your point, Robert, is that in The Wealth of Nations, the invisible hand, which was the sort of dictum of neoliberalism, actually occurs once, halfway through a 1,200-page book, and he spends about the next 2 chapters qualifying it, and shows how states have to govern, and he actually comes up with socialized startups companies as part of the rhetoric here, and I think you're exactly right. So neoliberal cut off that whole social domain entirely, and I think that's correct.
So my question sort of puts Dan and Rob in conversation a little bit. Rob, you ended by saying this question of what kind of subjectivities are we going to sort of create? And one of the things that I think that's related to is the question of affect. So when we talk about precarity or bodies who disrupt in these sort of radical activist tactics, one of the things they're doing, of course, is making arguments and advocating for policies. But I also think that they're training their bodies in a certain sort of way. And I think that precarity isn't something that you have. Precarity is something that you you cultivate, right? And I'm wondering to what extent rhetoricians can cultivate precarity, or to what extent these kinds of bodily tactics might be useful in terms of constructing the kind of subjectivities that would maybe have different operative tactics or something.
I guess I would want to say that precarity is both something that we might diagnose in material terms and something that we might rhetorically craft. I don't want to give away, I don't want to delink it from the material. But yes, as people Aristotelianly artistic, we craft meanings of precarity. And so I think that's maybe one starting point. The body in public, and this is why activism is so instructive to me, because there are so many different modes of being public that were performed even by the same person. And so one might participate in arguments with others in a sort of rational, critical forum, but their body, as they're doing it, their body might already signify something grotesque. All right, I think that's interesting. If we look at Phaedra Petzulo's work, one of the examples she talks about the toxic tours and the alternative protest. to display what we might call a naked body, a woman's body that is without breasts, is a powerful public argument apart from anything else that's said about that body or from that body. And so I maybe that's a glance, is it an indirect connection to your question? Or?
Well, I'm just sort of thinking about not bodies as signifying, right? But bodies as constantly becoming.
Yeah.
And so that when I participate in those kinds of strategies, I am therefore different from having done so.
That's interesting. In some of the classic public sphere stuff talks about we relate. So Hauser and Blair, for example, 1982, is fresh in my mind. They talk about a public persona. So we approach. We're public beings, and that's a kind of persona that's different from this other kind of stuff. There are lots of critiques about that because there's some kind of bracketing stuff that's going on there that critique, including kind of public critique, is that no, we can't really do that. But I think you're right to say that maybe affect theory is going to help us pluralize our understanding of what are the modes of engagement with each other, what are the modes of engagement in public discourse. Because I think we are, when we put our bodies in those ways, we are different. We're triggering something. That is a force, right?
I guess one thing maybe I would add to that is that, I mean, I think there's a tension about bodies and neoliberalism and some of these changes. So on the one hand, there's a disciplining in Foucault's sense, where we internalize these models. But I think maybe what I hear you saying a little bit with affect is there's an excess, right? That, I mean, there's something that escapes that disciplining. And so, and it's particularly if it's that sort of embedded, embodied sense of, that ultimately gets expressed as emotion, but this sense that I mean, it's hard to articulate affect in words, right? It's sort of contradictory to the idea, but, this sense that we feel that something resonates with us in a particular kind of way. And that, I think, can be a kind of tension against sort of the disciplining effect that we have to internalize these market models. But I would still say that at some point, and maybe this is, I think, why I think the global is a promising site of resistance, is we can't do that alone. And so affect, qua affect, is not political. Affect has to be made political. And to the extent to which that becomes an individualist project, it merely reinforces kind of the individualism of neoliberalism. What has to happen is the reestablishment of these connections, these social bonds. And that's an embedded process, right? That's, I think, why something where we can be with others and interact with others can potentially be a powerful way to do that and provide a set of resistance.
We'll go all the way to the back.
Right. So I see Klein's argument as kind of like, we need to have action now, right? And her answer is that we need to have this citizen activism or activism at the small scale. I guess I'd just love for any of you, if this is like the public engagement panel, right? Like to comment on the efficacy of that book to mobilize people, maybe her audience, and maybe what kind of audience she is potentially alienating, sort of through her Jeremiah kind of rhetoric, and then how you see kind of public engagement in real time. Like, we're all kind of, she's preaching to the choir in a way to me, and we're all kind of buying. I think everyone here believes in climate change and knows that it needs to happen, but like, I've personally never done any of this blockadia stuff, so like, I don't know, just commenting on how you see this book fitting in with public engagement and whatever. Big question, man.
Well, I said a few things, and what struck me the way you phrased the problem is that we need to act now, and yes, we do. In the book, Meg underscores that point, but I think one of the things I was trying to talk about is that the rapidity of response sometimes disguises other kinds of temporalities that might matter for how the public or counter-public is constituted. It reframes the basis of a local conversation. And I don't mean to be stupidly ignorant of the fact that the planet is in peril, but even the rapidity of the response is something that I believe rhetorically or sociologically that we can at least talk about, because there's different kinds of response frames. The stuff I was talking about, to take it down to something very practical, is resilience is a boutique notion as far as I know. Boulder is one of the 100 resilient cities, and but resilience as a frame for public engagement suggests to me that it will not happen all through dialogue, that there needs to be other framings. That could be temporal, that could be the body circulation stuff, that could be routes of traffic. Some are defined technologically, but some of them are, as we know, we have many routes for travel. So that that is a powerful way to think about public engagement that is less based on service or outreach or direct action, and really more coming up with a different way, as I tried to at least gesture in my talk, that interaction can be imagined. And I so depend on the notion of we have to imagine a world before we even get to the point of dialoguing about it, and that imaginary space is so very vital. So there's a few comments.
And I see a connection between your questions, comments, and what Kathy was saying. And that is that, well, so a couple things. One, I mean, these things are going to happen if they already happen at a micro and macro level. And so the kinds of changes that Klein alludes to with references to privatization and market logics are 30, 40 years in the making. At the same time, at very local levels, people move to expand vouchers, to weaken environmental protections and concerns about, say, water runoff, right? So, I mean, any kind of response has to happen in the same way, that any effort to sort of change these things is going to take some kind of macro sense of change, but that has to also happen at the micro level. The connection I see to Kathy's question is that, so the claim about ice caps melting, water levels rising in 30 years, that perhaps, there's an abstraction about those kinds of claims, whereas the idea that one's drinking water, right, has been contaminated, and one's own children and children in the community are being poisoned, presents a kind of immediacy, which goes back to the sense of embodiment, affect, being kind of embedded. So, I mean, will Klein's book sort of motivate change? I think almost certainly not, because single books don't change the world, at least not in a kind of overnight sense like that. Will a coordinated and relatively autonomous set of actions make change? Perhaps, and I think that's why we have to look to successful models that are already in place and see how those can be built upon.
I think we're at time, so we'll carry on this conversation in lunch. So graduate students will help guide you over to the other side of the floor. We have a lunch.
Are we leaving the building for lunch?